Good evening and welcome to Rasha Christi, South Africa. And we're delighted to have you again on our weekly interviews with scholars from across the world on important topics. Rasha Christi is a student campus ministry. We exist to serve students on campus in terms of helping them better understand reasons for the Christian faith, whether those are historical, philosophical, or scientific reasons, to first of all strengthen the faith of Christians on campus, and then to also equip them to better engage those around them who don't share the Christian worldview, for the sake of ultimately sharing the gospel with them. And so it's an organization that began in the United States. It has now gone international. We currently have 5 chapters in South Africa at Stellenbosch, Pretoria, Northwest University, UKZN, Maritzburg campus, and also Rhodes University. And so we have a website. Please do take a look at our website, rashachristi.co.za, where you can find some free resources as well. And we also publish articles there, which usually come out on a weekly basis as well. So you can avail yourself of a lot of those free resources. And on top of that, we have a YouTube channel. So you can please subscribe to our YouTube channel and recommend it to others, particularly young students, high school students, and younger than that, but also university students. But everybody's welcome to join our YouTube channel. And we've got a growing library of interviews and lectures on all kinds of topics that are very much a part of the conversation, certainly amongst Christians, but I think are part of the conversation in the culture. And so it's our privilege this evening to have back again with us Dr. Michael Keas. Dr. Michael Keas is a good friend and colleague of mine. He works, he's on one of the board members of Rasha Christi, and he's also a fellow with the Discovery Institute. In addition to that, he is a professor or a lecturer at Biola University in California, where he lectures on the history and the philosophy of science, and has published a number of articles and books. He's written a great book, which I encourage all of you to consider reading, called Unbelievable: 7 Myths About the History and Future of Science and Religion. And so he's an expert in this area of the supposed conflict between faith and science. As a student of the history and philosophy of science, he's very much very much familiar with this debate, which of course is a massive debate amongst those who are critical of the Christian faith. And so he's an expert in this area. And so it's a delight to have you with us again, Mike. Good evening and welcome to Rasha Christi, South Africa.
Thank you, Simon. And it's great to be back virtually in South Africa after having been there in the flesh in 2019.
That's right. Yes. Dr. Keas has also graced the shores of our country. In fact, we did a spectacular road trip here in South Africa. We did a tour of South Africa where he spoke up in Johannesburg, here in Potchefstroom, Northwest, and then we traveled all the way through Uppington, a long way around down to Cape Town through the Karoo. He really loves nature. We stopped off on the West Coast and we did some talks there, and then down into the Western Cape, and then we came all the way back through Port Elizabeth, through past Rhodes University, and up through KZN. So we had a mammoth trip around the country, and so Mike was on a road trip with me. And we had a great time. And so it was, hopefully you can come and join us again, Mike. We've got more parts of the country we want to show you.
Sounds fantastic, Simon.
Yes. Well, I know that you've got a lecture prepared for us this evening. And just to let the audience or those on YouTube know that this is a kind of a second part of a 2-part lecture that Dr. Keas has put together for us. So do go back on our library on YouTube and you can see the first lecture tied to this. And this is going to be a continuation of that talk. And Dr. Keas has a PowerPoint presentation here to continue this lecture. So he's just going to share screen with us now. So Mike, if you can jump across to share screen and then dive into the lecture. And then once you're finished, we'll dive into some Q&A.
Okay. Do you see my slide?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay. Very good. So my last lecture was entitled, Is Only Science Reasonable? And that was, of course, a critique of the very prominent view called scientism. Notice it's not science, but scientism. And scientism is the philosophical position that only science is reasonable, and they particularly have in their crosshairs the religion. They don't want religion to be on the same plane with science as being a rational discipline. Now, this view of scientism, as that is the opinion that only science and not religion is reasonable, is supported by a number of fake history stories about science and Christianity typically being at war. And I mentioned a couple of those last time, but I want to go into more detail on two more of those today. And I also noted how scientism not only is supported by these fake history stories, but it ignores how Christianity has had a positive impact on the development of science. And I gave an example of that last time, and I'll give a new example tonight. It also assumes, scientism assumes that there's no way to rationally evaluate religion. And I gave the resurrection as an excellent example of using the standard methods of historiography, that is the study of human history. You can weigh the evidence for and against the resurrection. So it is really valuable. It can be evaluated. In fact, Christianity is the most testable of all religions. You can test it in ways that are very similar to how you test theories in the natural sciences. And I'll be developing that theme a little bit more tonight in a way that I didn't last time. So let's look at two big myths about science and Christianity at war: the Dark Ages and Galileo versus the Church. Okay, so let's start with the myth that says that Christian Europe was anti-science and held back the development of human reason in general during the so-called Dark Ages. Now, the truth is that when Christianity rose on the world scene out of the Roman Empire, the Romans themselves didn't highly value science that had been previously developed particularly among the ancient Greeks. So early Christians did, to some degree, absorb this attitude of, well, science might be a little bit helpful, but it's not that important. But as Christians began to build their own civilization called Europe, they clearly created a science-friendly culture that became the birthplace for a little bit later than that, modern science. So let's see how that happened. Going back to the end of the ancient world, and with a figure, St. Augustine, who was greatly influential throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. St. Augustine once wrote that we should proceed by most certain reasoning or experience to figure out how God made things, or the nature of things, as he called it. And indeed, there were quite a few books through the Middle Ages that had titles like The Nature of Things. And it was an investigation using both reasoning and experience, which would include observational experience, of course. So that was a very productive intellectual trajectory that a very influential church father helped to establish. Now, if we fast forward to the High Middle Ages, let's just pick an example of a medieval scholar who developed some interesting ideas about light. Roger Bacon, of course, absorbed what the ancient Greeks and Islamic workers had done on the topic of light and vision, and actually performed some experiments, not just thought experiments, but actual physical experiments with light, and helped to discover some of the principles of optics. Christians also invented an institution that helped to perpetuate the scientific tradition called the university. So the university is a Christian invention, and it became the institutional home for the sciences. The church supported these institutions, but they didn't micromanage them. They allowed a lot of academic freedom within them. Now, there's a website called History for Atheists, and it's hosted by Tim O'Neill, who is an atheist, and he likes to note how atheists get their history wrong, and the concept of the Dark Ages is one of those examples that he says is central to several key elements in New Atheist bad history, that is, inaccurate history. So even though O'Neill doesn't believe in God, he does get the history right, and so he's on our side to that degree. And it's just interesting to show that someone who has studied history carefully notes that the New Atheists have misused history for their advantage. So the Dark Ages, as typically understood, never happened. Medieval Christians overcame the Roman sort of low priority view of science and created the foundations of modern science. So that myth is easy to dispense with. It's really not controversial that the Dark Ages really, I mean, to call the medieval period the Dark Ages is itself not in sync with contemporary intellectual study of history. It's called the medieval period. Dark Ages is an older term that has since been discarded, but still some New Atheists continue to use that. Now, there's a much more complicated myth that I'm sure you've heard of, and that is that Galileo, one of the most famous scientists of all time, was imprisoned and tortured by the church for his scientific proofs. So the myth says that he proved that the earth moved and that the sun, not the earth, was in the center, and the church simply dug its heels in and ignored his proofs and did all kinds of bad things to him. Science, Galileo versus religion, the church. That's how it's usually depicted. But the story is much more complicated and interesting than that. So let's take a look at what Galileo saw through his telescope. He noted that for the first time ever, Jupiter has moons, and Venus goes through phases somewhat like the phases of our moon, that is crescent phase and half phase and so on. Now, particularly the phases of Venus just kill the ancient astronomical view associated with the name Ptolemy. But it didn't prove the Copernican theory, which Galileo hoped he could do. Now, even the Jesuit astronomers at the Collegio Romana, the flagship higher education institution in Rome that defended Catholic orthodoxy, even the Jesuits agreed with Galileo that Jupiter has moons, Venus has phases, and a number of other things that he saw through his telescope, such as the moon, our moon, has imperfections on it, mountains and valleys, as they call them, what we now know as craters. So now, in a recent book, just this came out this year by a very prolific physicist. In fact, he was a co-founder of string theory. He says that the Jesuits and he said that the Catholic Church considered Galileo's discoveries heretical. But in fact, the Jesuit astronomers at the time of Galileo agreed with Galileo about what he saw. Now, they disagreed on the interpretation of what he saw. And of course, that's typical of science. So let's look at just the phases of Venus. I just got to do a little bit of basic astronomy here, which I enjoy teaching for a quarter century, by the way, to college students. So let's just do a little bit of this, and then you can understand the significance. All right, so on the left side, you see a diagram that would be the case if the Copernican system were true. That is, the sun is in the center, Venus is going around the sun, and Earth, in turn, is going around the sun in a larger orbit than Venus. So Earth's orbit contains the smaller Venus orbit. And so if that system of the world were true, then over a period of time, you should see Venus going through different phases, similar to our moon phases. And you can see in the foreground the crescent phases, and in the background, the larger, almost full or gibbous phases of Venus. And in fact, that's what Galileo saw through the telescope. He saw all those phases, the very thin crescent phase and the very large gibbous phases, kind of like an almost full moon. Now, on the right side of the diagram, or on the right side of the slide, you see another diagram depicting the world if the Ptolemaic system were true. Now, according to the Ptolemaic system, Earth is at the center at rest, and Venus goes around the Earth on a large circle, which in turn has another circle on it that carries Venus around it. So it's called an epicycle. And if that were true, notice that there would be no gibbous phases. Because the sun would be behind Venus, the little circle that Venus goes through. And so Venus would always be in these smaller phases of crescents, never in a gibbous or almost full moon-like phase. Now, since Galileo proved that that Venus does go through these larger phases like gibbous, like the moon, it did clearly show that the ancient view was wrong, that the Ptolemaic view was wrong. But there was a third option that is often left out of the story, and that's the Tychonic view. Now, let me show you a diagram of the Tychonic view, which was the leading interpretation at the time of Galileo. Now, according to this view, Earth is in the center. That's like the old Ptolemaic view, is in the center at rest. The sun goes around the Earth. That still sounds like the Ptolemaic view. But what was new about this is that Tycho Brahe, who invented this view, said that the Venus, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn all rotate, or all revolve rather, around the sun, which in turn revolves around the Earth. Now, if this were the case, well, Venus would go through phases just like the Copernican system. So this Tychonic view was consistent with all the new telescopic discoveries that Galileo had made. And so the Inquisition, which later tried Galileo, was correct to conclude that Galileo had exaggerated his case for Copernicus and against Ptolemy by leaving out a third option. That is, he does kind of in a subtle way deal with the Tychonic system, but he doesn't give the Tychonic system the credit it was due at the time. Because if we limit ourselves to just what was known at the time of Galileo, this Tychonic view was actually fit all the evidence best at that time. Of course, now it doesn't. But at that time, this view was the best supported theory. So the chief inquisitor of the Catholic Church, a guy named Bellarmine, he once wrote in a letter intended for Galileo's eyes and for others, that if Copernicanism were ever to be proved, and of course it hadn't been proved yet, then he wrote, one would have to proceed with great care in explaining the scriptures that appear contrary. So this Catholic Church leader was not against science. He was against the premature claim that the Copernican view was proven when it hadn't been proven yet. And he was correct, it hadn't been proven yet. And Galileo and many church leaders got a couple of things right together. Many of them agreed that the Bible describes how nature appears. So terms like sunrise and sunset, rather than earth turn, which technically would be the scientific description, sunrise and sunset, there's no error in using that. In fact, even scientists today still use those terms because they're observational terms. Even Copernicus used the term sunset, even though he thought that it was caused by the earth turning. So as Galileo once wrote, quoting another church leader, that the Bible teaches us how one goes to heaven, not how the heaven goes. Little play on words there. That is, not how, what's really moving, what's at rest, is the sun at rest, is the earth at rest, that sort of thing. The Bible wasn't intended to teach those cosmological issues. So Galileo and church leadership agreed that the Bible is without error. So it wasn't like Galileo was against religion. He wasn't a skeptic. He believed in the Bible and thought it was without error. And he also thought, as did many church leaders, that you can find other truths through science, and that ultimately the two would agree if you interpret the two correctly. But of course, they had different interpretations. Some scientists were in favor of Galileo's conclusions, but most scientists at the time were not. Some theologians at Galileo's time were in favor of his conclusions theologically, but of course, most finally disagreed because the science was unsettled. And at the time, and in fact, Galileo was trying to make progress against the majority viewpoint in science, even though the evidence at the time really wasn't sufficient to establish Galileo's case. A generation or two after Galileo, of course, the case was made beyond reasonable doubt. But okay, so what happened to Galileo? He was called to Rome for trial. There was no lengthy jail time. He wasn't tortured. He actually had incredibly good food and lodging during the time of his trial. And in fact, I went to his home in Florence. There I am, standing at the door, where he, after his verdict was given to him of vehement suspicion of heresy, not actual heresy, but just suspicion of heresy, he was forced to retract his views, and he lived in this country estate, which you see. You walk in the door, and to the left is his lodgings. He had a beautiful garden. So he wasn't locked up anywhere, but he did have restrictions as to who he could see and what he could do. So the Catholic Church, I think, was definitely guilty of overreach here. But if Galileo had been more modest and tactful, if the Pope at the time hadn't been under a lot of different political pressures that were way beyond science and religion, if the politics were different, this story would have turned out much differently, most likely. Particularly if Galileo hadn't put in the mouth of one of his characters in his book that was at issue in the trial, if he hadn't put the words of the Pope in the mouth of this simple-minded guy that looked really like ignorant in his little dialogue where he was discussing these views, if he hadn't done that, the Pope wouldn't have been offended, and probably there wouldn't have been a trial, if that, and a number of other things had lined up just right. So there's a lot of contingencies that led to the trial. So I'm not defending what the Catholic Church did, but I'm saying that it wasn't, this whole story is much more complicated than science versus religion. Galileo himself thought of himself as a faithful follower of Christ and a Catholic. So it's not Inquisition means Christianity, Galileo equals science. There were scientists on both sides and theologians on both sides of this conflict. So the real story is much more complicated. And what we really have here is an instance of premature science or adolescent science and Christianity trying to find their way. And my advice, kind of what's the take-home lesson from the story, is if there seems to be a conflict between science and Christianity at any given time, just be patient. Do your homework. Do the very best science, see where the evidence leads. Do the best theology, see where that leads. And eventually, you'll sort out any apparent conflicts and find how they're in harmony. And that's the actual track record that we find from the history of science and theology. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Kepler as a pioneer of kind of the really core methods of science, what we call theory virtues or theoretical virtues, because it shows how not only was there not an all-out war between science and Christianity. That's the negative part. I'm debunking the negative part by showing there weren't really the Christian Dark Ages. Galileo really wasn't against the church. He was trying to educate his own church, and there were theologians that supported him as well. But he was in a minority viewpoint. So it took a while to sort that issue out. So I'm debunking the false stories about supposed warfare, but then there's the positive side of the equation. What evidence do we have of Christians making contributions to science that were rooted in their theological understandings, rooted in their beliefs about God? And Galileo and Kepler are both good examples, but let's just focus on Kepler for a bit. Now, what are the theory virtues? What are the traits of a theory that indicate likely truth? I've written an essay on this, published in a leading philosophy journal, and there are 12 major theory virtues. Kepler was a pioneer in discovering some of the virtues on this list of 12 virtues. The first virtue is an obvious one. a theory should fit the evidence that you know of at the time that you construct the theory. And then there's a number of other traits of a good theory: causal adequacy, explanatory depth. So explanatory depth goes beyond just fitting the evidence, but it's a more rigorous understanding that seems to show that we've really gotten to the bottom of things. Besides these, besides these first three evidential virtues, there are the virtues that have to do with coherence or consistency. And then there's the aesthetic virtues that have to do with beauty and similar concepts. And then there's the virtues called diachronic virtues, which is the track record of a theory over time. And you can apply these to the debate about what happened after Jesus' death, the debate about the resurrection. William Lane Craig does a great job. He applies a number of these, not all of these, but a number of these theory virtues to that debate. And you can apply these to scientific debates, just about anything to some degree or another. Now, Kepler was a pioneer of this, and Kepler grounded the theory virtues in his understanding of God as creator and God as the self-existent one who didn't have a beginning. So as we think about how these theory virtues are grounded, how it is that they actually work to help us to find truth, or at least approximate truth, we find that following Kepler's lead, that the truth detecting role of these theoretical virtues, or TVs as I abbreviate them, such as internal coherence and beauty, would really make sense if God exists and if God created a world that is an expression of his own beauty and internal coherence and other attributes of God. So if God makes the world, and if God creates humans and our minds, then the consistency in God's creative acts, making the world and making humans in his image, would give us confidence that both our minds and the world outside of us reflect the attributes of God, like internal coherence and beauty and so on. So this was with a little more development than Kepler, so it's a little more mature than Kepler, but Kepler had the basic idea that much of what we take to be the traits of a good theory are rooted in God's attributes. And a lot of this wouldn't really make sense if there was no God, which I'll try to unpack a little bit later. So, for example, in Job in the Bible, we have this interesting quote: "Who has put wisdom in the inner parts?" Okay, the inward parts. So, and who's given us understanding to our minds? Well, of course, it's a rhetorical question. God is the obvious answer that was intended by the writer of Job. So it's God who gives the human mind the ability to know truth and to do research in the sciences or in human history or in any field. And he wants us to be able to develop our minds and to love him with all of our minds. So the Bible supports this reliable mind-world connection. Now, of course, because we're fallen and finite, often we make mistakes. We misinterpret the natural world. We might misinterpret the Bible. But we have to do our homework, do our best to minimize the foibles of humanity and to recognize that we're still made in the image of God despite our fallenness. And so we're going to be able to have some degree of confidence that our mind can connect with the world outside of us. So so these theory virtues function in a truth-oriented way because of what I call API, the attributes of God, the creative plan of God for the world, and the image of God in us. So API, attributes, plan, and image. And Kepler was on to quite a bit of this, and I'll give you a quote to give you an idea of how he was on to quite a bit of this. But atheism really can't properly ground the theory virtues. And I quote a very prominent philosopher of science, Alex Rosenberg, who wrote the leading textbook in the philosophy of science. It's used for college survey courses on the philosophy of science, which I use in teaching at Biola University. And he says that natural selection produces a lot of false but useful beliefs. Now, he'd like to target that on just religion, to say that religion's useful and it evolved as a behavior because it helped us to pass on our genes. But this it shows that Rosenberg opens the door to if atheism and unguided evolution are true, then that would undermine our confidence in our reasoning capabilities, really in any field, even in the sciences. So atheism has a very difficult time grounding the theory of virtues, kind of like, when in the moral argument for God, Craig and others make the case that atheists can be good to some degree. They can know what's good, but their own worldview doesn't ground moral categories. Well, in a similar way, I'm saying that atheism has a very difficult time at grounding these epistemic virtues, that is, traits of a good theory, and how it is that they work. Now, Rosenberg not only wrote a leading philosophy of science textbook, he also wrote a book called The Atheist's Guide to Reality, where his atheism comes out, in all of its colors. Now, he argues in this book that science is our exclusive guide to reality, and he calls this correctly scientism. That's what scientism is. That's what it claims. And he says this is the world view of atheists like himself. And he gives a list of examples of what this worldview entails. Is there a God? No. What is the nature of reality? Whatever physics says it is. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. And so on. You can look at the others on this list. These are quotes from his very popular book, where he's trying to say, hey, look, I'm a philosopher of science, and I'm an atheist. And I'm an atheist because science helps to support my atheism. That's the claim. But when you look at his list, for example, take the second one. What is the nature of reality? What physics says it is. Well, technically, physics is a great way of focusing on a very limited number of questions about the physical nature of reality, how things, which is applied in the study of cosmology and the study of how objects fall, and let's say near the surface of the Earth in free fall, and how they accelerate and so on, how they impact, and so on and so forth. So physics is really good at answering those kinds of questions, but physics as a discipline doesn't tell you if there's anything outside of the cause and effect structure of the physical world. It's focused on physical questions and the cause and effect structure of that world. But it doesn't tell you directly whether there's anything beyond that. It's not even equipped to do that. So to say that the nature of reality is whatever physics says it is, really he's imposing an atheist view. It's implicit in the very way he set up this deal here, because physics, for practical purposes, limits itself to just physical reality. It doesn't really tell you whether there's more than there's anything non-physical, the existence of the human soul or God or angels or so on. It's because it's not, that's what it was. It wasn't designed even to address those questions. So Rosenberg makes it look like science is supporting atheism when really he is just, it's sleight of hand. It's physics isn't designed to answer those kinds of questions. Is physics good at answering and the questions about physical reality? Of course it is. That's what it's designed to do. It's the best way we have of knowing physical reality, but it's not equipped to tell us if there's anything beyond that. So Rosenberg is making illegitimate use of his own field of science and philosophy of science to try to prop up atheism, and he does a really poor job at it. But I do use his textbook in my Biola course because I think it's a great way to introduce students to the philosophy of science and then show some of the shortcomings of his own views. So now getting back to Kepler. Kepler, remember, was a pioneer in identifying what are the main traits of a good theory, that is, theory of virtues, and how they're grounded. Now, Kepler wrote in 1599, around the time he was making some of his famous discoveries that are still in astronomy textbooks today, like his laws of planetary motion. And he wrote that those laws are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his image so that we could share in his own thoughts. So notice here that he is grounding the ability to recognize truth, or at least approximate truth, in physics and cosmology by the fact that we're made in God's image. God made the world, God made us in his image, and so our minds can connect with some degree of accuracy with the world, and we can discover truth. And he argued that the way we come to know these laws of nature are by identifying their evidential accuracy and their beauty and other traits of good theories, and that these traits operate the way they do because of, again, God's attributes, his creative plan, and his image in us. He roughly argued that, of developing this a little bit further than Kepler was able to take it, but a lot of this is rooted in Kepler's own thought. Let me give you another primary source quote to make my case that Kepler was onto quite a bit of this. Kepler once wrote that God, quote, introduced nothing into nature without thoroughly foreseeing not only its necessity, but its beauty and its power to delight. In other words, God as creator loves to create things that have a certain beauty to them, whether that's a waterfall or whether that's the beauty of the molecule of water itself, H2O. There's a certain beauty and simplicity as a special kind of beauty that scientists have often identified as a trait of a theory that's likely to be true. So now, just because an idea is beautiful and simple doesn't mean it's necessarily true, but it is one of many traits, like as I pointed out earlier, about a dozen major traits that indicate likely truth. And Kepler was onto this, and he noticed how he grounds this in his theistic view of the world, that God as creator helps make sense of how beauty as a trait of a good theory actually works, and has a good track record of discovery in the history of science. Now, notice Kepler's last words, in case you're wondering. Maybe he was just using God talk, but he really didn't believe in God personally. When asked about the basis of his salvation when he was on his deathbed, he responded confidently that he was saved solely by the merit of our Savior, Jesus Christ. So for Kepler, Christianity wasn't just window dressing to try to make his science more acceptable to a Christian audience. Kepler himself was a devoted follower of Christ. And he thought that Christianity was a reasonable faith and that it was consistent with science as a reasonable way of finding truth about the natural world. So is only science reasonable? Well, Kepler would be a great case study to show that one of the greatest pioneers of science thought that both Christianity and science are both reasonable. So in other words, the modern view of scientism just doesn't hold water. The view that only science and not religion is reasonable. All right, so there you have it. Let's go to some questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. Very good. I know that I actually, that question of Galileo and the church it comes up very often in conversation with people on a personal level, and when you're dealing with skeptics, they'll often point to the Galileo affair. So maybe just summarize to help a lot of the students in conversation. What would be 3 key things that you would point out from a practical point of view? Like if I bumped into somebody who said, "Well, don't you know what the church did to Galileo?" What would be the 3 basic facts there that you would help sort of just to get them to think again? I mean, I would typically say, well, I don't think that's what happened historically, but what would be the 3 main things that you would point out to them?
Yeah, well, first I would point out that professional historians of science, like myself, whether they're believers in Christ like me or not, most of them are not, have shown that the typical presentation of Galileo in the church, like in science textbooks and popular literature, gets the history wrong, just simply wrong, by trying to make it look like Galileo was a skeptic who was fighting the church. He wanted to be a faithful member of his own church, and he was trying to persuade his own church of particularly the leaders that didn't agree with him. Some already agreed with him, but the ones that didn't agree with him, he was trying to persuade them that science and theology are compatible, and that that the earlier church theologians who talked about an Earth that's stationary and the sun moving never really addressed that topic rigorously. It was just kind of, well, there was really no good scientific arguments for a moving Earth for a long, long time. Galileo comes on the scene. He's got some new arguments that are pretty good, but still not conclusive. So it took a while. This episode is really showing that when there is a new developments in science, sometimes it takes a while just to sort them out. So I would encourage your students just to be patient. If there's any issue today that bothers them, that they think is some teachings of their that they take to be the case of in their interpretation of the Bible seems to be out of sync with science, is just study both forms of revelation thoroughly. Both nature and scripture are both forms of revelation. Galileo himself talked about the book of nature, following St. Augustine, the book of nature and the book of scripture as being two forms of revelation, and that if you carefully study them both, eventually you're going to see how any apparent conflicts are only apparent and not real. So the Galileo affair, yes, the church was guilty of overreach, but that was a faction. It happened to be the majority faction within the church was guilty of overreach, but there was a minority viewpoint within the church that agreed with the Galileo. So you can't just say it's the church versus Galileo and science, because there were scientists on both sides and there were theologians on both sides. Similar to a lot of issues today, you'll find theologians that take different viewpoints about matters that have to do with the relationship between science and religion, and you'll find scientists that take various viewpoints. So I think that helps to show it wasn't just a simplistic story of science always makes progress by debunking religion, and religion is always trying to hold back science and trying to stuff your head into the sand and so on. So I think that's the take-home lesson.
Okay, well, that's good. That's very helpful. I hope that will help a lot of the folks listening in tonight. Just a quick little bit of history there. Just in terms of you mentioned the history, the process that this took there. So maybe just unpack that for us now. So at the time of this big debate, obviously at that stage, I think it was the Ptolemaic view was the inherited from Aristotle, was the prevailing view. And then there's a Copernicus, but then Galileo follows Copernicus, and then Tycho Brahe. Maybe what is the actual length period? I'm interested to know how that is, because as you said, sometimes there's a lot of debates going on with various theories and various challenges to those theories. What was the actual period of this debate? How long did that span?
Well, Copernicus published his book in 1543, so that's middle of the 16th century. Kepler and Galileo were two of the very few proponents of Copernican astronomy in the next couple of generations. So Copernicus 1543, his major publication, he died just shortly after that. And then Kepler and Galileo are publishing primarily in the early 1600s. So that's about 50 plus years later. And then they publish over a number of decades their various works. And so at the time in the early 1600s, during the time when Kepler and Galileo were mainly addressing these issues, they were in a tiny, tiny minority in the scientific community. Often people don't realize there were very, very few people arguing for the Copernican system. Most, especially after Galileo's telescopic discoveries, that would be 1610 and following. Most scientists dumped the Ptolemaic, ancient Ptolemaic view, and went with the Tychonic view, that third option that I mentioned. And I showed you the big diagram of that. And so
Tycho Brahe.
So Tycho Brahe had amassed a huge amount of astronomical data over his lifetime. He was the leading astronomer just prior to Galileo and Kepler. Kepler actually worked for Tycho Brahe, inherited his data after his boss died, and then showed how, and then used that to argue for the Copernican theory. But none of this stuff was all this stuff got worked into Isaac Newton. That's now in the late 1600s. Okay, after Kepler and Galileo are dead and gone, Newton in England picks up on this, building on the work of Kepler and Galileo. And finally, in the late 1600s, you have a really good case for the Copernican theory. But it still doesn't, I mean, a very, very strong case. And then it took another 100 years or so to really work out all the details. But by the time of the late 1600s, it was beyond reasonable doubt that the Copernican theory was true, and that both the Ptolemaic and the Tychonic views were not true. But the Tychonic view was the majority viewpoint in the middle through much of the 1600s, and a lot of people forget that, and that's why they anachronistically, because the Tychonic view is totally forgotten, they just think of the Ptolemaic view and the Copernican view, and they leave out the third option, and that makes it look more like a warfare narrative than it actually was. And so that's the missing piece that I'm trying to remind people of.
So was the majority view, the Tychonic view, was that the view that the church, for the most part, said, well, we're siding with the majority view on the scholarship now, because I mean, from 1543 to the late 1600s, you're looking at 150-year kind of debate going on here. There's probably a number of popes who've since passed on since this conversation, from 1543 all the way through to the late 1600s, where the heliocentric view begins to get reinforced by various discoveries and proofs, Kepler, and then, as you said, Newton and that. So, I mean, that's a 150-year conversation. So it's not just and I think that's important.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about, issues in science and Christianity today, both within the church and out. There's all kinds of issues out there, but it may take several generations to work through a lot of these issues, and that's fine. I mean, you just need to be patient with the process. But look, if God, we have great reasons to believe that God exists, that Jesus is His Son, and many scientists believe this, and they did their work. And even if there were some things they couldn't figure out how they fit together, they knew that ultimately truth is coherent with itself. God is the creator of the world. He's the creator. He's the one who inspired the Bible. It's going to all work out in the end.
Yeah. Just another thing now, is there any other kind of, since you lecture in the history of philosophy, is there any other kind of development in the history of philosophy? I mean, the history of and philosophy of science, in which a theory like this big debate in cosmology, the Galileo affair, if we can call it that, where you can say, well, here's another example of a view that was held by the majority, and then subsequently guys came up and they challenged it, and they had a bit of a tough time, and then this theory itself that was marginalized ended up becoming. Is there an analogy between this? Because it might be useful for the skeptic to say, well, this Galileo affair is not unusual within the history of science. Is there something like that within the history of science that we could point to as an analogy, to be helpful conversation?
Well, in my my essay on the theory virtues, which if you just Google Keas virtue, you'll find it, Keas. I give a case study of in geology of plate tectonics. Now, for a long time, continental drift, which later became known as plate tectonic theory, continental drift was a small minority viewpoint, and there was some circumstantial evidence in favor of it. The overall shape of Africa and South America, how they fit together. And it looks like puzzle pieces that once were all tightly fitted together in earlier Earth history. But there was no known mechanism, no plausible mechanism, how you could get these massive movements of continents. But of course, later on, it became clear what that was. It has to do with convection currents in the lower part of the Earth, and so the geophysics was eventually worked out. And the earlier, like Alfred Wegener and other early continental drift theorists, many of them were ridiculed as this is totally bogus stuff. But over many, many generations, this got worked out. Now, in that case, there wasn't much in the way of debate in the church about whether continents were once together or not. Now there is a debate about the age of the Earth, but even those who thought the Earth was young, I happen to think it's old, but those who thought it young tried to think of ways in which you could have rapid movement of the continents. I think that's a pretty difficult task to manage, but still, I'd say, hey, let all the theories develop. Let everyone who wants to test these theories, they should have the academic freedom to test them. So I think that it's important to follow the evidence where it leads, to have an environment in which criticism is of any theory are welcomed, and that there's not a thought police out there trying to exclude theories that have unsavory worldview connotations, particularly for the reigning, for the leaders of academia today who don't want any theories that implicate a God or that are friendly to Christianity, because there's all kinds of other baggage that they think comes with Christianity that they don't want in the university, they don't want in the public sector. But yeah, there's plenty of scientific controversies where there were minority viewpoints in one period of time that later became shown to be true beyond reasonable doubt. So the Copernican system, plate tectonics, and you could come up with dozens of other examples of this.
Yeah, I think I've spoken to some of my friends who are geology guys, and they talk about the theory of catastrophism, how there is a kind of gradualism that is presupposed, but we're now kind of well aware that in the history of the Earth, there's been some pretty cataclysmic events which do have a marked significance. And yeah, in fact, in Potchefstroom, just outside, I think we went there, Mike, we have the Vredefort Dome, which is this massive meteorite impact zone. And that's a fascinating area of geology and what that did to the interior of this southern portion of the continent here in Africa. Anyway, I've got a number of questions that have rolled in here from the folks on YouTube. So first question is, why do atheists not believe in free will? Is it because they don't believe in the existence of the human will?
Well, I'll pick Rosenberg as an example, since that was one of the points that I didn't cover on that slide.
Yeah, I think that's where they came from.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, if humans are the result of a purely material, unguided process, well, atoms, molecules, they don't freely decide to do one thing or another. They just do what they do by the constraints of natural laws and by the contingencies of various natural events that happen to occur. So you have natural laws and chance that are, I think they help explain a lot of things about the world, but I don't think they're the only thing that explains the world. But those like Rosenberg, who wants to say it's just everything is a result of natural laws and chance, then whatever is going on up here is just an epiphenomena of brain chemistry, and what you think to be your free decisions is really just subtle ways in which natural law and chance events deceive you into the illusion that you have free will, when in fact it's just particles and electromagnetic radiation and chemistry doing their thing. And they don't have, there's no, when we study the physical aspect of reality and the chemical aspect of reality, we would agree with atheists. There's no free will in physics and chemistry. But Rosenberg wants to say reality is what physics says it is. Remember, and I critique that because physics isn't designed to answer lots of questions. It's not even equipped to do that. So it's a little bit of a deceptive move to try to say that reality is what physics says it is. Well, the physical reality, the physical level of reality is pretty close to what physics says it is, but there's other levels of reality we have good reasons to believe in, for drawing from disciplines beyond physics, such as philosophy and history, human history. Yeah, I think, but I think even though Rosenberg wants to say there is no free will, he still, we all have first person experience of our deliberating, do I do this or do I this? And there seems to be overwhelming evidence that humans do have free will. Not all naturalists, people who believe that nature is all there is, follow the viewpoint that there is no free will. Some of them want to argue that there is, but they have a hard time grounding that in naturalism, in nature as the whole show, for reasons that Rosenberg brings out in his writings when he argues against free will.
Yes.
But it's really weird, because if you think about reasoning itself, scientists engaged in acts of reasoning, they choose topics, they do their work, the mental processes by which science occurs and any reasoning occurs involves making choices. And it's not just the world of physics and chemistry causes science to come into existence. Science itself is a result of, as Einstein once put it, the free choices of the human mind help us to generate hypotheses, questions to ask. We have to generate questions to ask of nature. And
yeah,
a lot of that has to do with the particular context of the scientists, the culture they grew up in, so on, might have an influence on that. But they have to decide they want to study this, and they have to deliberately apply their mind to the world. And a lot of this involves free decisions that at least seem so in our, as we reflect on the way our mind operates. So I think that the case against no free will is a very flimsy case, but a lot of atheists feel like they're obligated to make the case, and Rosenberg is one of those.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty standard position from a lot of people. You follow a lot of atheistic scholars. They'll say that, if you read their works, Michael Ruse, for example, Richard Dawkins, so that they say that so that is a very important debate, but one which we will have to take up another evening. Here's another question for you. Is there a specific platform or ministry that aims to compile scientific research from a Christian worldview?
A number of them are out there.
Perhaps you can throw a few out there for our viewers.
Yeah, sure. In California, Southern California, there's Reasons to Believe. In Pasadena, California, Hugh Ross is a prominent apologist in the sciences, and their group is specifically a Christian group. Discovery Institute, which I'm a fellow of, is not specifically Christian, although there's definitely a strong Christian influence there. But it has been devoted to looking at the evidence for design in nature. And then, of course, my own work is also showing that science itself as an enterprise fits well within a Christian worldview. So Discovery Institute, Reasons to Believe, and of course, Reasonable Faith, William Lane Craig, and Ratio Christi around the world.
Yes, of course,
at least connects with those who are doing this in the sciences. Of course, Ratio Christi is interested in much more than just the sciences.
That's for sure. Yeah. Okay, so there's a number of ministries out there as well. And I know that there's actually a lot more than that as well. So they're actually, if you look around, you'll see a number of them. Some more questions here. Yeah. How do modern theories that seem to contradict religious beliefs, such as Darwinian evolution, square with your integrated science and religion?
Yeah, well, I'm a critic of the contemporary versions of Darwinism that are out there, in a similar way as Steve Meyer, my colleague at Discovery Institute, whose trilogy of books now, major books, Signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt, and his latest one, The Return of the God Hypothesis, shows that you can build a comprehensive case for Christianity based on the sciences and other fields. And in the area of the sciences, part of that critique is a critique of Darwinian evolution. I taught biology to college students for a quarter century, and used a number of great resources, such as the textbook Explore Evolution. Explore Evolution was designed for the public sector. It's not it doesn't even argue for intelligent design. It just argues, like, shows that the case for Darwinism is very, very weak. Now, students reading this book many of them will naturally infer some kind of intelligent design or a belief in a creator, but the book itself doesn't address that issue. So that's a great resource. And then Discovery Institute has a number of other simple to, kind of entry-level books on this topic, such as Discovering Intelligent Design. Casey Luskin is one of the authors of that, and Casey's, of course, had spent some time in South Africa. So I'd recommend those kinds of resources.
Okay, yeah, there was actually one of the questions. Can you please share a list of resources? There's a number of them out there as well. I'll tell you a good introduction to this, a very basic introduction that I found personally quite helpful for somebody who doesn't have a science background but is interested in this debate, was John Lennox's God's Undertake. I think it's a very helpful little book as well on the topic, and I encourage people to look at that. Next question here. Does the Inquisition's investigation of Galileo give merit for the conflict view of science and religion?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned Robert Bellarmine as the chief inquisitor, or as I like to call him, the Grand Inquisitor. He rose to power around 1599. He was involved in the trial of Giordano Bruno, who was burnt at the stake, not for science, though, as I show in a chapter of my book, Unbelievable, but mainly for his theological / philosophical views. So Bellarmine was like number one Mr. Inquisition guy. Okay, so I'll give him as a kind of a case study. Bellarmine, when it came to the Galileo affair, and even Copernicanism prior to when Galileo jumped in on the topic, Bellarmine actually did have an interest in studying what science he could understand, particularly with the help of the College of Rome, there near the Vatican, where you had a number of great scientists, astronomers and others. And Bellarmine, as the leading inquisitor in the early 1600s, he died just shortly before the Galileo trial itself. But anyway, he once noted that there's this passage in the Psalms that talks about the heavens will grow old like a garment. Johannes Kepler also quoted that same psalm and made a similar point, that we have reasons from Scripture to think that the universe is not eternal or able to exist indefinitely. There are changes that occur up there in the heavens, whereas the ancient pagan Greek view was that the heavens are eternal. They're basically static, other than perfect circular motion, and they never change. They just have always been and always will be. And of course, modern science has come strongly on the side of there is a history to the cosmos. It had a beginning and has a development, and so on, and that things naturally do fall apart. Second law of thermodynamics is since the 19th century has been a way of expressing that. So the Inquisition leaders like Robert Bellarmine were not anti-science. They studied science to some degree to kind of get a handle on those issues that overlap with theology. Obviously, they had their own scientists that were Catholics, like Galileo, like the Jesuits at the College of Rome, who were experts in the sciences. But even the theologians in the Inquisition were conversant with science. They were aware of developments. They were concerned that they kept up with whatever the latest developments in science were that overlapped with theological issues. So I don't think we can really fairly paint them as holding back science. Remember, Bellarmine said, if you could prove Copernicanism, then we would, of course, have to understand the Bible in a way that was consistent with a moving Earth around the sun. And in fact, that's what eventually was the case. And theologians now have no problem with that issue. But it took a few generations to work through that. So And what's really interesting is the Inquisition in its investigation of Galileo, which is the center point of the question at hand here. The Inquisition was actually correct that Galileo had failed to prove the Copernican theory. Historians of science today who are not Christians agree that the Inquisition was correct that Galileo had failed to prove his theory in his own lifetime. Now, it wasn't until the time of Newton that was really, you could really say that was the case, that it was proven, or at least shown to be very, very likely to be true. Now, I think the Inquisition should not have forced Galileo to recite a prepared statement saying that he no longer believes these things about the world and so on. I think the Inquisition was guilty of overreach, but there were a lot of other church leaders in other denominations who wouldn't have done that. It was, so you can't just say the Inquisition equals Christianity. There were a lot of different denominations and different church leaders who were dealing with similar issues, but wouldn't have condemned Galileo in the way the Inquisition did. So the one, I'm trying to have a balanced view here. On the one hand, I don't agree with everything the Inquisition did, of course not. But on the other hand, you can't treat them as just anti-intellectual, anti-science, because that's not true either. So I think history is often messy. You have to, it's not like, you have clearly the good guys and the bad guys. It's human nature to make mistakes. And people in power, whether they're in power today or in the past, they're going to make mistakes. And we shouldn't follow leaders blindly. We should think critically about what any leader is saying, whether they're in the church or in the sciences or in philosophy or whatever. And that's what Ratio Christi is all about, right? Is making informed decisions about all the major questions.
Yep, absolutely. Here's another question then. It said, you said physics is a field of study used to describe the physical world. Do you think there will ever be a field of study with a base in science able to explain the spiritual world?
Right. Well, you can, well, sort of indirectly, yes. Those who study the human mind/brain, so cognitive science, psychology, and then in the medical field, psychiatry, where you're dealing with different pathological sort of tendencies, obsessive compulsive behavior, and so on. There are, for example, there's a leading clinical psychiatrist, psychologist, Jeffrey Schwartz, who I know in Southern California, who's done a lot of clinical work with OCD patients, obsessive compulsive disorder. And he has shown, and a number of others in the field, that through therapy, you can, to a large degree, overcome OCD. And in so doing, you actually physically rewire your brain. There's actually, as they do brain scans, they see that the brain has actually changed, and they call that neuroplasticity. So there's an example where I think it's a science, a natural science, let's say the science of the human brain, has at least shown that there seems to be ways in which deliberate choices on the part of human patients can overcome a disorder like OCD, and that this, or at least in part, maybe not totally, but largely overcome it. And it actually involves change in the physical structure of the brain. So there's a good example where a natural science does suggest that there's something more than just the brain. There seems to be the you inside of here who can decide to overcome something and actually change your brain. And then but I think that's kind of an indirect support for that there's more to you than just your physical body and your brain, that there's the non-physical you. But there's great philosophical arguments for the soul, or for the non-physical aspect of you. And some of those philosophical arguments do link into some scientific findings. Some scientific findings, like the one I mentioned, can be used as part of a larger argument for the existence of the non-material aspect of humanity.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And then one of the questions here was one of the questions asking they're interested to know what exactly are your academic credentials. And Mike, maybe I didn't get a chance in introduction to reel those off, but that a lot of people, you're talking about a very diverse subject. You have a lot of knowledge here, history and philosophy and science. It's fantastically
Sure.
interesting. But maybe you can give us a bit of a breakdown of your academic education.
Right. I completed a bachelor's degree in biology. I was a physics double major. Didn't quite finish the physics degree, but I took quite a bit of physics as an undergraduate. And then I went on to do my master's and PhD in history of science. And I did it at the University of Oklahoma. Now you think Oklahoma, it's in the middle of the United States, it's, whatever. Hey, actually, Oklahoma University has one of the best history of science collections in the world. I have personally held in my hands Galileo's most famous book, the dialogue concerning the two chief systems of the world, with his own handwriting in the margins. I've held that in my hands for about a minute and a half. You don't want the oils in your skin to ruin the book, right? So I held it in my trembling hands for a minute. That is in Oklahoma, okay? So University of Oklahoma has a leading history of science PhD program, and that's where I got my degree. But then I retrained as a philosopher while I was teaching full-time at Biola University. Now it's just on the side, I teach a little bit, full-time from 2005 to 2008. So I sat under J.P. Moreland, Doug Geivett, number of Tom Crisp, who's considered one of Alvin Plantinga's leading students, studied under all those guys, not for credit, just sat in on their courses, did the reading, and participated to retrain as a philosopher. Now, as a historian of science, I had previously done work in philosophy, because history of science and philosophy of science are sister disciplines. There's a lot of interchange between the two. But I did retrain as a more general philosopher. And then I've only published one major piece on the philosophy of science. It's, again, if you Google Keas Virtues, you'll find it. And it's published in Synthesa, which is a European journal that is in the top tier of all philosophy journals. So it's particularly a leader in the area of epistemology in relationship to the natural sciences. Epistemology, of course, is the branch of philosophy that studies the theory of knowledge. What is knowledge? How do you justify your beliefs, and so on? And that essay, if you Google that and find that essay, go ahead, download it, take a look at it. You'll find that over 10,000 people have downloaded. I already have like 31 plus citations in peer-reviewed journals. So I am, even though I informally retrained as a philosopher, it's really what matters is, do you publish in that field, and is it recognized in the peer-reviewed journals? And that's not just some esoteric topic. The theory virtues or theoretical virtues is a central topic in the general philosophy of science. It's really, really important for how for understanding how science works, and for how many different fields work. Because I argue that many of these theory virtues operate in other disciplines like human history, and can be applied in evaluating the resurrection, as Craig does. So that's a little bit of
Brilliant.
what I've done, and it's been great fun. Join me to get an advanced degree in some of these fields, and put your hand to the plow.
Yes, no, look, I love history, and it's one of the areas that I really enjoy studying and reading, and certainly the history of science and the history of philosophy are of particular interest to me. So I do enjoy listening to this stuff. But yes, Mike, I just want to say on behalf of Russia, South Africa, thanks once again for doing an interview for us, and doing 2 in the last 3 weeks. And I know that we have scheduled you in for the future, because I know you've got a lot more stuff that you want to tackle for us. So we're about to embark on our next 2 weeks. We've got an online conference coming up with a really stellar lineup. It's a really privilege to have the program that we have. So for all of you listening in, do consider our online symposium, which we put online because of the COVID restrictions, coming up Monday through Thursday next week, and the week after that, from 6 o'clock to 10 o'clock at night on South African time. And we have a number of world-class speakers, a number of them Dr. Keas here knows and his colleagues with. We've got Dr. William Lane Craig, also from Biola University, We've got some of the guys from the Discovery Institute, Dr. John West, Dr. Casey Luskin, Paul Copan, who's a philosopher as well. Tim McGrew, also a very accomplished Christian philosopher from Western Michigan University. We've got a number of South African scholars contributing, Dr. Louise Mabille, Dr. Daniel Maritz, and also a number of guests from around Africa, Kevin Marithri from Kenya joining us, and a number of other scholars are going to be joining us. So we've got a really stellar lineup for the next 2 weeks. And so I encourage all of those listening in to tune in to Rasha Christie Monday through Thursday next week and the week after that. But Mike, thank you very much. Take care. It's good to see you. We'd love to see you back again here in Africa. And do give our regards to your lovely wife. Give her a big hug from the braces. And thank you so much for taking some time out to come and share your knowledge with us.
And thank you, Simon, and all the great questions tonight. It was great.